When my mother passed away, I thought I was prepared to handle grief. But days after the funeral, I began receiving anonymous letters. I assumed they were condolences, words of support from someone who couldn't attend the service. However, the first letter was anything but comforting. It was cold and straightforward, mentioning my father's name. The man I'd grown up believing had abandoned us when I was just a child. According to that letter, he had never left town. He'd stayed nearby all along, hidden. The words carried some kind of implication I couldn't grasp, as if my mother had concealed secrets to protect me. Now, though, those secrets were coming after me. The letter referenced an incident in 1989 and the disappearance of a girl during the town's festival, something I'd never heard anyone mention, neither family nor the few friends who remained in town. In 1989, I was only 3 years old. My memory was a blur of popcorn and carousel rides, nothing remotely dangerous. Yet the letter implied my father was somehow involved. I wanted to ignore it, toss it aside and forget, but something wouldn't let me. It felt like a weight, a tension pushing me to uncover the truth, even as I sensed I might be stepping into something perilous. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one felt more personal, as if the writer knew me. It mentioned details from my childhood that only someone very close would know. It spoke about specific places in town that I barely remembered, like the park where the old festival took place. It said that if I wanted to understand, I needed to go there. A shiver ran down my spine, and my stomach churned. But I ignored the fear and went to the park the following weekend. It was abandoned, with rusty rides and tall grass hiding the old stalls. Everything there seemed frozen in time, cloaked in a sense of neglect, as if the memories of that place had been deliberately buried. As I walked through the park, memories returned. The sound of the carousel, the smell of burning popcorn. It felt as if, any second, I'd hear the cheerful, distorted music that used to fill the place during festival days. Then, near the main stage, I saw a cross made of branches thrust into the ground, with a faded red ribbon tied at its center. It didn't make sense, but it brought a feeling of weight and discomfort, like I was treading on forbidden ground. I felt a presence there, as if someone were watching me from afar, judging me for being there. I tried to convince myself it was just some abandoned memorial, but something about it felt menacing, as if the cross had been left there to ward off anyone who came near. Days later, I received a third letter. The writer seemed to know I'd been to the park and had seen the cross. "You've started to see," it said, "but are you ready to see it all?" It gave me a lump in my throat. It was as if whoever was behind this was pushing me deeper, revealing piece by piece a past that didn't belong to me, yet I was a part of. This letter contained an address, an old house on the edge of town, and suggested that if I wanted to understand, I should go there. For the first time, I wondered if this was just a cruel prank. But at the same time, something told me the person writing these letters knew exactly what they were doing. The house was worse than I imagined. The windows were broken, and the roof looked ready to collapse. The front door was ajar, and I entered with my heart pounding, fighting the urge to run. The place smelled of mold and rotting wood, with an almost absolute silence, as if no one had entered in decades. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing in the emptiness, until I saw stairs leading to the basement. It didn't seem like a good idea, but curiosity pushed me forward. I descended, and as soon as I set foot in the basement, an intense cold washed over me, as if the air were filled with an invisible presence. The basement was almost empty, except for an old chair positioned in the center. Dark stains surrounded it, and what unsettled me even more was a red ribbon tied to the back of the chair, identical to the one on the cross in the park. Those stains. I didn't need to touch them to know they were old, yet potent marks of something that had happened there. Something soaked into the walls and floor. It felt as though the house itself had absorbed that energy. I began feeling watched again, a sense that something there was awake. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, but it echoed in the basement like a shout. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing. Just silence, now even heavier and more oppressive. From then on, the letters kept coming. Each one brought something more personal, closer, as if the writer was trying to show me something I still didn't understand. One letter delivered a direct message that left me frozen. He never really left. You're the next piece. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a threat. With each letter, I understood less, feeling lost in a labyrinth where every clue revealed more secrets, but never the full answers. A few days later, I received an old photo in one of the letters. It was a black and white picture of the festival, with several people smiling. In the corner of the photo was my father's face, staring directly at the camera. Beside him was a young woman I didn't recognize. On the back, someone had written, September 1989. A cold realization hit me. My father had been at the festival and was likely involved in the girl's disappearance. He wasn't the man my mother had painted him to be. Perhaps she had known about this dark side and had kept it secret all her life. I sought out relatives to try piecing things together. They avoided the topic, saying I should let it go, as if I was meddling with something dangerous. I felt alone, isolated, as if I were the only one unaware of this family secret. At that point, the idea of giving up started to make sense, but it was too late. I needed to know the truth. Then came the final letter. The handwriting was familiar, something I hadn't seen since childhood. It was my father's. He spoke directly to me, as if he knew I was close to uncovering everything. He admitted he had been involved in the girl's disappearance, but claimed he had no choice, that greater forces compelled him. At the end, he left a line that haunts me to this day. Don't look any further. If you value your life, stop here. Was that a threat or a warning? Either way, the message was clear. I should never have started searching. After that letter, no others came. It was as if everything had ended abruptly, but the effects lingered. I tried to move on, yet the feeling of being watched never went away. I started noticing shadows, little signs that seemed to whisper that this story isn't over. Deep down, I know I'll never have all the answers, and it's as if something in this town has kept that secret forever. And now, I'm part of it, whether I want to be or not. When they finally found Beatrice, it felt as if the entire town held its breath for a moment, as though the relief came with something heavy and unseen. She was discovered in a distant clearing, in a part of the woods where even adults avoided going. How could a 10-year-old girl have gotten there alone? She was alive, but the shock seemed to have erased any trace of emotion from her face. Beatrice didn't speak or react. It was as if something inside her had been taken. She stared into the void with an expression that chilled the spine, her eyes fixed on a point no one else could see. Her mother knelt at her feet, crying, calling her name, but Beatrice seemed so distant that she didn't even recognize her own mother. With each passing second, the air grew heavier, more suffocating. In the days that followed, the tension only grew, especially when the police arrested Antonio, the reclusive, odd neighbor who lived 2 houses away. He was the type of person people preferred to ignore. Too quiet, too distant. Ever since his wife left him, he'd lived alone, surrounded by rumors and distrust. When he was caught trying to flee to the next town, everyone immediately assumed he had something to do with what happened to Beatrice. He swore he knew nothing, that he was leaving, because he knew they'd accuse him. But for the townsfolk, it was too late. The town was split. While some demanded justice, others feared that an unjust accusation would bring something even worse upon everyone. When Antonio was arrested, we all thought peace would return, but things only grew darker. Beatrice remained mute, trapped in that distant, fixed gaze, as if she were seeing something that the rest of us couldn't bear. The doctors said the shock might be permanent, that she might never be the same again. Her mother began to waste away, drifting through town like a ghost, while her father, Carlos, became a darker version of himself. He avoided everyone, his gaze always heavy, as though he were carrying something no one should see. Something within him seemed to be dying, and his face bore a torment that unsettled anyone who crossed his path. A few days later, the town was engulfed by a silence that only exists before a tragedy. Carlos was found dead at home, a scene that sent shivers down the spine. He had taken his own life, leaving a short note beside him, hastily written, each word carrying the weight of a boulder. It said he knew who had done that to his daughter, but preferred not to live with the truth. His words seemed soaked in guilt and anger, as if he'd discovered something unbearable. He didn't name names, leaving only a void filled with meaning and horrors for each person in town to interpret in their own way. With Carlos's death, speculations ran wild. Some swore he knew more than he'd told the police. Others believed he'd done something terrible himself, and, unable to face it, took his own life. Personally, I didn't know what to think anymore. Every night, when I closed my eyes, that empty look on Beatrice's face haunted me. It seemed as if there was something deeper there, something too dark for any mind to endure. And those words in his note, "Not live with the truth." No matter how much I tried to imagine what he'd discovered, I always felt a sense of despair, as if I were standing on the edge of an abyss I should never approach. Then the police released Antonio for lack of evidence, and the town was swallowed by a muted, painful rage. Some saw him as the victim of an unjust accusation. Others saw him as a guilty man who'd slipped away from justice. Antonio returned home, but he wasn't the same. He walked like a ghost, and the very air seemed to chill when he passed. People crossed the street when they saw him, but the fear went beyond that. It was as if he carried a trace of something impure, as if the very ground beneath him bore a weight no one wanted to understand. Meanwhile, Beatrice remained frozen, as if somehow the truth everyone feared was still trapped inside her. In time, the town sank into a dense silence, a foreboding that something terrible was still on its way. I remember one afternoon seeing Beatrice and her mother in the square. The girl looked like a specter, trailing her mother like a soulless doll, led without any will of her own. People only watched from afar. No one dared speak to them. It was as if an invisible weight separated them from the rest of the world. Something so dark and profound, it seemed to feed on people's fear, growing, waiting. Until one night, I was home, gazing idly out the window, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was around 2 a.m, and the whole town was asleep, steeped in absolute silence. In the middle of the street, I saw Beatrice. She was barefoot, wearing a thin nightgown that seemed to glow eerily under the dim streetlights. She walked slowly, her feet dragging along the sidewalk, her gaze lost. A chill ran down my spine. Something inside me warned me not to approach her, as if that simple act could bring me face to face with something my mind couldn't bear. I stayed there, frozen, not knowing what to think or do. The next day, I tried asking her mother if she knew Beatrice had been out that night, but the woman seemed even more fragile, a shell of someone who no longer knew where to find answers. And, to make things worse, a rumor spread through town. Some neighbors swore they'd seen Antonia walking down the street that same night, with the same vacant look, as if he were sleepwalking. It was as if something had taken hold of them, something that didn't belong in this world. I no longer knew what was real, but a new fear began to grow within me. As the days passed, rumors of shadows began to surface, apparitions at night, strange whispering sounds in houses that should be silent. I tried to ignore it, but one night, it was my turn to hear something. Soft sounds, a brushing against my bedroom window, a muffled, continuous noise. I mustered the courage to look outside, but all I saw was the wind rustling the trees. Still, that night, I dreamed of Beatrice. Her pale face, her empty eyes, staring at me. I woke up drenched in sweat, with the feeling that all of this was far from over. That's when I decided to understand what was happening and started talking to the elders. They spoke of an old story, of a resident who disappeared without a trace after doing terrible things decades ago. Each account grew stranger, but one thing became clear. Something in this town held a secret people preferred to ignore. It seemed that if we spoke too much about it, we would bring something to life that was better left asleep. The last time I saw Beatrice was at a fair, a few days later. But something about her had changed. She seemed awake, but her eyes held an inhuman coldness, something beyond comprehension. Her mother looked relieved, but I could hardly look at the girl. It was as if something had been taken from her, or worse, as if something new had been placed in its stead. I didn't stay to see what would happen next. Shortly afterward, I moved away, but even now, I wake up in the middle of the night with her gaze in my mind. And since then, I have never wanted to know what truly happened in that town. I grew up in a small, forgotten town deep in Poland, where old factories and gray concrete buildings painted a bleak landscape, stuck in a time that seemed never to have left the Cold War. The air felt heavy, as if saturated with decades of untold stories. And at the town's edge, always visible, stood the old chemical plant, abandoned and draped in ruins. It was as though the plant itself was a monument to something we never wanted to understand. Back then, we always heard rumors that in the 80s, the plant had conducted secret tests with chemical substances for military purposes, but no one knew for sure. It became a legend until recently, when people began to disappear, always near the ruins. It was a cloudy Saturday afternoon, the sky a shade of gray that made time feel vast and motionless. My friends and I, like any teenagers without direction, thought exploring the plant would be a way to debunk these stories. We figured it was all nonsense. The metallic smell in the air hit us as soon as we passed through the rusted gate, and the cracked concrete, covered in moss, seemed to devour time itself. The old pipes jutting out of the ground looked like twisted claws reaching for the sky, as if trying to escape their own past. There was something in the air, as if the place wasn't just abandoned, but watching. Something was there, and somehow it didn't want to be found. As soon as we stepped into the plant's corridors, the silence seemed to press against our ears. It wasn't normal silence. It was thick, as if sound itself was swallowed by an abyss. Even our voices seemed muffled, as though we were speaking in a dream. The walls, covered in old marks and faded symbols, radiated a sense of urgency, as if they were warning us of imminent danger. One of the symbols, which looked like a biohazard warning, sent a chill down my spine, but no one dared to comment. The unease grew when, in one of the deeper rooms with broken windows, my friend Kuba saw something. He didn't say anything at the time, but the fear on his face was enough. He seemed to have seen a figure standing at the entrance of another corridor. When we finally managed to get out of there, he tried to brush it off, saying it was just a reflection. But the way he kept glancing over his shoulder didn't convince me. The fear that he knew something the rest of us didn't spread like a fog. As we continued our exploration, the air grew thicker, and the metallic smell became nauseating. At one point, we passed by a metal cabinet that looked as if it had recently been locked. Although rusted, one of them was intact, as if someone had hastily locked it. The door seemed jammed, but when we tried to open it, we saw a rusted handprint on the surface, as if someone had desperately tried to escape from inside. The feeling that something was there, or someone, hit me so violently that I could barely breathe. That's when we heard the noise. A heavy metallic sound echoed down the corridors, as if something had fallen. Panic gripped us all. When I looked back, I realized Daweed was no longer there. The silence after our screams felt even heavier. We ran without looking back until we escaped the plant, but at some point, we knew we weren't alone. Outside the plant, the silence around us felt crushing. We tried to convince ourselves that Daweed must have gone back alone, but deep down, we knew that was just an excuse. When we called him and his mother, the truth hit us like an unbearable weight. The police were called, but we only told them part of the story. We said we'd just passed by the plant, but the officers, especially an older one, gave us a dark look, as if he knew something we couldn't comprehend. He muttered something about the plant's cursed legacy, and his words echoed in my mind. The following days were saturated with a growing sense of dread. Daweed had vanished, and the whole town seemed immersed in a watch silence, a tension no one dared to name. More disappearances began to happen, and with each one, the symbols in the plant, the rusted handprints, the metallic smell were etched deeper in our minds. I couldn't shake the feeling that the plant had never truly shut down, only hidden itself, rooting into me. I could no longer sleep without thinking about what we had unleashed. Today, the town is empty, as if something has swallowed its soul. Stores close early, the streets are deserted, and the plant's presence is still felt, like a shadow that refuses to disappear. Daweed was never found, and although I left the town, the feeling of being watched, the metallic smell, remain with me. No matter where I go, the weight of the plant's legacy haunts me, as though that curse has never ended. My family and I had moved to a small, isolated town in Canada 2 weeks prior. Coming from the chaos of the big city, the silence and slow pace were almost unsettling. My wife, our 2 kids, and I had come in search of peace and a simpler life, far from the noise. The streets were too quiet, windows were always shut, and there was a kind of heaviness in the air, even amidst the calm. On our second day, our neighbor, Mr. Carpenter, invited us to a barbecue at his house. He insisted it was a community tradition to welcome new residents. We thought the invitation came a bit quickly, but we accepted. After all, it seemed like the perfect chance to meet our neighbors. As soon as we arrived, I sensed something was off. The people were well dressed and smiling, but there was something almost rehearsed about their behavior, as if every gesture was measured. When we walked through the door, the smell of grilled meat and burning wood was overwhelming, almost stifling, and the welcome was overly warm, as if each person was observing us with a clinical eye. During our first conversation, a man with a piercing stare casually mentioned the school our children would be attending. Then, a woman with a forced smile mentioned the exact neighborhood we'd lived in before. I thought they might have looked up this information out of curiosity, but with each new person who approached us, more details about our lives surfaced. Things only someone watching us would know. Over the course of the evening, the tone of the conversation shifted, and increasingly, personal questions began to emerge, with an unsettling ease. They asked about my wife's former job, a detail neither of us remembered sharing with anyone there. My wife, caught off guard, responded briefly, but I noticed how those around us fell silent, leaning in, listening closely. A neighbor, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, fixed us with an intense stare and asked in a vaguely cynical tone if our children had been sleeping well since we arrived. Something in her smile was disturbing, and my wife and I exchanged a glance, as the boys actually hadn't been sleeping well, but we'd never mentioned it to anyone. That question was a warning sign, and a feeling of intrusion washed over me. I tried to move away from the group, to look around and get a better sense of the house, but no matter where I went, someone would approach, always polite, yet with an invasive presence. At one point, Mr. Carpenter himself commented on our dog, a detail no one there should have known. It was as though every fragment of our routine had been carefully documented, and I began to sense that we were part of some plan. The friendly air of the neighbors now felt more calculated, an effort to conceal what they really wanted from us. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The previously cheerful laughter became hollow, and the gazes almost ravenous. The urge to leave became more urgent when I suggested to my wife that perhaps it was time to go. She agreed, visibly tense. But each time we tried to make our way toward the door, a neighbor would appear, holding our shoulders a bit too tightly with a wide smile. "Leaving so soon?" they would ask, their tone almost authoritative. The pressure to stay was explicit, and I began to feel a weight, as if we were no longer free to leave. At one point, I looked out the window and saw one of the neighbors standing outside, looking directly at our house across the street. He was motionless, almost like a statue, until he turned his head to stare at me, with a smile that felt more like a warning. A chill ran down my spine, and I tried to hide my unease, but my discomfort was evident. I casually mentioned that it might be best to head home because of the kids. One of the men nearby chuckled, a low and ominous laugh, saying, "Children always adapt, eventually." My wife suggested I fetch our children, who were out in the yard. When I found them, I expected them to be playing, but they were quiet, sitting side by side, looking down. Their expressions were strange, as if they had seen something they didn't understand. Behind them, a local boy held a wooden doll, roughly carved but disturbingly similar in appearance to our older son. I asked where he'd gotten it, and the boy stared back, solemnly replying, "It's to help him feel at home." My stomach turned, but before I could say more, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the yard. I pulled my kids back inside, and when I found my wife, she looked pale, her gaze fixed. Before we could exchange a word, Mr. Carpenter appeared, looking at us with that empty smile, commenting, "We thought you'd fit in well. It's a shame to see you like this." His tone was disappointed, mixed with something that bordered on possession. I knew, at that moment, that we never should have come. We tried to act naturally as we moved toward the door, but with each step, it felt as though we were being monitored. The house seemed to shrink around us, and the neighbors positioned themselves strategically, subtly blocking every exit. As we reached the hallway, I noticed that everyone was engaged in low conversations, yet their eyes were locked on us, as though they had rehearsed this behavior. My wife squeezed my hand tightly, and I saw the panic in her eyes. We were surrounded. Suddenly, one of the neighbors, with a frozen smile and a penetrating gaze, stepped in front of us, saying, "Leaving without trying dessert? Here, no one leaves before savoring every last moment." That final phrase echoed in my mind, heightening my desperation. I looked around and realized that even the windows were being watched, as if they were sure we wouldn't escape. With every step toward the exit, one of them would move closer, like pieces in a game where we were the prize. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. A shelf full of old photographs, each showing different families over the years, all posing with those same tense smiles, with the same houses in the background. Horror washed over me like a wave. Those photos were of other families, the new residents who came before us. Realizing we were just another family in a long line of new residents, fear took over. My wife saw the photos too and let out a trembling murmur, at which several neighbors turned to look at us, almost in unison. The tension on their faces finally broke, revealing something darker, as if a mask had fallen. I realized that if we didn't act quickly, we might end up like those families in the photos, trapped in a cycle I couldn't even begin to understand. With a hurried excuse, I tried to divert their attention, moving toward the door. But when I reached for the handle, Mr. Carpenter grabbed my arm with unexpected strength, his smile empty and controlled. "You're part of something greater now. Leaving isn't an option," he murmured, and his words echoed through the room. That mix of terror and desperation gave me strength. I yanked my arm free, and the calm expressions on the neighbors' faces vanished. They exchanged glances, as if sharing a dark understanding, as though there was an unspoken order not to let us leave. As we pulled our children out of the house, the light seemed to dim, and each step became a struggle against the oppressive weight of that stifling atmosphere. We finally reached the door and bolted onto the cold, deserted street, running back to our house without looking back. We didn't want to know what was really happening there. We only knew we needed to leave as soon as possible. We reached home with our hearts racing, and I drew all the curtains while my wife tried to calm the kids. The silence on the street, which once seemed peaceful, now felt suffocating, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward us. We sat in the darkened living room, listening for any sound outside, alert to every noise. Around 3 a.m, we heard slow, methodical footsteps passing by our window. The measured sound echoed, then faded at the end of the street. The next morning, we didn't waste any time packing. As we left, I noticed some neighbors watching us from afar, unsurprised, as if they already knew our stay would be brief. As we passed the gate, I saw Mr. Carpenter standing at the corner, staring intently, muttering something I couldn't make out. That final glimpse was enough. We left without looking back, and to this day, when I think of the faces and empty gazes of that community, I get the same chills. We never learned what was there, but one thing I know for sure: no one stays for long. I grew up in a small, forgotten village, tucked away in some remote corner of Eastern Europe. There, traditions were as deeply rooted as the twisted trees of the forest surrounding us. Their roots seemed to intertwine our lives with the superstitions of the past. From a young age, I would hear about the harvest festival, a ceremony that marked the end of the labor in the fields and heralded the start of an uneasy rest. Everyone took part. It was like a silent pact, from the youngest to the oldest, that at the end of each year, the village would come together to celebrate, sing, and give thanks for a bounty that sometimes seemed almost magical. But as the years went by, something dark began to hang over the celebration. People started disappearing, and they weren't strangers or outsiders. They were familiar faces, neighbors who shared the same tables and the same daily struggles. At first, everyone pretended not to notice, maybe out of fear, maybe out of convenience. I, too, ignored it until last year when horror knocked on my door. That night, the air was unnaturally cold, and the wind howled eerily, as if carrying secrets and threats. The elders insisted on the importance of following the rituals, the old dances around the fire, the offerings of grains and fruits to Mother Earth, and the burning of bitter herbs, which they claimed drove away evil. For us, the younger ones, it sounded like a superstitious relic, a futile attempt to ward off invisible shadows. I, myself, thought bringing a modern touch to the festival would breathe new life into the village, that the old beliefs could be left behind. But then, during the celebration, something happened. Thomas, my childhood friend, was by my side, laughing, dancing, under the firelight that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I turned for an instant, and he simply vanished. No one saw where he went. No one heard a scream. It was as if the darkness around him had swallowed him whole. And that night, as the wind carried the sparks from the fire in opposite directions, I finally understood the weight of the old warnings and what, perhaps, we should never have challenged. That night brought a biting cold, and the wind howled as if carrying a dangerous secret. It was a sound that seemed to want to warn us, something ancient and instinctive, sending chills down my spine in a way I couldn't understand. The elders always insisted that the festival should honor the ancestral rituals, the dances around the fire, the offerings left at the feet of Mother Earth, and the burning of bitter herbs, which, according to them, kept dark forces at bay. We, the younger ones, paid no attention to these beliefs. To us, they were superstitions from a bygone time. I thought that adding a modern touch to the celebration would make everything feel lighter, less suffocating. But then, during last year's festival, everything changed. Thomas, my childhood friend, was with me, dancing and laughing, his face lit by the pulsing glow of the fire. And in an instant, he vanished. It was as if the fire had swallowed him. He simply disappeared, without a sound, without a trace. At first, we tried to convince ourselves that he had just stepped away for a moment, perhaps to get some air or find a dark corner to rest from the drink. But hours passed, the party began to empty, and Thomas didn't return. Unease took over us. Along with a few friends, I started calling his name, our voices echoing in the heavy silence that enveloped the festival square. The darkness seemed thicker that night, almost solid, and the silence carried a menacing weight. Every shadow seemed to hide something alive, a hidden presence watching us, and every noise made us glance over our shoulders. We tried to seek help from the elders, but they just stared at us with cold eyes, shaking their heads in heavy denial, as if all of this were pointless. One of them muttered something that sounded more like a sentence. He broke the rules. To my generation, these rules always seemed absurd. Who would care about a dance around the fire or the burned herbs that supposedly had magical properties? But as I looked around, feeling an increasing discomfort, I noticed my grandmother's face among the crowd. There was something in her gaze that froze me. It wasn't fear or surprise. It was resignation, a silent understanding that what had happened to Thomas was inevitable. I asked her, with an urgency I couldn't contain, why no one was moving, why no one was looking for him. She just lowered her eyes and murmured in a firm but empty voice, "When the harvest is ready, the earth asks for it back." These words sank into my mind like an enigmatic omen, echoing, dark and unanswered, as I looked at the darkness around us and understood that Thomas hadn't been the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The rest of that night was a whirlwind of anguish and frustration. We, the younger ones, organized ourselves into groups, armed with makeshift lanterns, and made our way to the village's outskirts, calling for Thomas with hoarse voices full of desperation. But as we advanced, it was as if the darkness was swallowing us, a thick, pulsing veil that seemed to close tighter with each step. The forest around us seemed to be watching, the branches of the trees shaking with the wind like thin, bony fingers, ready to grab us and drag us into that bottomless abyss. Each step forward brought a freezing chill that didn't come from the weather, but from something deeper, a cold that seemed to seep into our bones, our guts, making each one of us doubt our own courage. After hours of wandering, we returned empty-handed, our hearts heavy and our faces marked by exhaustion. As the sun began to rise, the village remained still, an eerie and unsettling silence broken only by the soft sounds of the elders resuming their morning routines as if nothing had happened. That indifference revolted us. We knew they were hiding something we were kept in the dark about. And deep down, each of us suspected that those disappearances were linked to the ancient rituals, but the thought of confronting them paralyzed us. Something told us questioning them would be a mistake. Still, some friends and I decided to investigate on our own. We felt the need to understand where these traditions came from, and above all, why they seemed to demand lives in exchange for good harvests. Our first destination was the village's ancient temple, a place most had abandoned except for the elders. The temple was small, almost hidden in the dense tangle of the forest, its old stone walls blending with the environment like an extension of the earth itself. Green moss covered every inch of the structure, and the trees surrounding it, thick and twisted, seemed to form a protective wall, as if guarding ancestral secrets. Inside the temple, the air was heavy, dense, and impregnated with a damp, musty smell, as if the very structure was rooted in the land itself. Along the walls, symbols carved into the stone depicted human and animal figures, all arranged in circles that converged on the back wall, where a towering tree had been carved in intricate, unsettling detail. The deep, twisting roots seemed to extend across the entire wall, while its branches rose up, forming a crown that dominated the space. I remembered my grandmother's words, whispered once in the dead of night, like a secret. That tree was the mother of all things, an entity that, according to them, nurtured the earth and demanded something in return. We stood there, staring at the ancient image, sensing that the answer to the disappearances was right in front of us, but lacking the courage to truly decipher it. As we examined the carvings on the walls, one horrifying detail caught our attention. Each human figure had marks carved into their hands and feet, as though they were chained or trapped in some way. In that moment, a terrifying thought formed in my mind. What if those who disappeared weren't taken far away, but instead offered to the very earth? The idea seemed absurd, even insane. But as we connected the dots, the dark scenario began to make a terrible sense. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind with startling clarity. When the harvest is ready, the earth asks for it back. That very night, I convinced two friends to return to the temple with me. Armed with lanterns, hunting knives, and a courage that seemed more fragile with every step, we set off. But no preparation could have been enough for what we found. On one of the side walls, almost concealed by the stones and thick vegetation, there was a small ancient door, locked with a rusted chain. With effort and some reluctance, we managed to force it open. As we pushed the door, we were met by a dense smell of wet earth and decay, as if the very air was made of shadow and moisture. A narrow, winding staircase lay before us, descending into a darkness that seemed endless. We descended in absolute silence, each step echoing in the oppressive void that seemed to swallow every sound. The air down there was thick and suffocating, almost as if something invisible was resisting our presence, trying to drive us away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached a circular, spacious room, lit only by the flicker of the lanterns we held with trembling hands. The floor was covered with strange symbols, carved with a macabre precision. In the center stood an altar, with remnants of melted candles and other objects I recognized from the festival rituals. Straw talismans, pieces of ribbons, small bones that could very well be from animals. But what if they weren't? What truly froze our blood were the marks on the floor, footprints. Some were faded by time, almost imperceptible, but others were fresh, clear in the damp earth. It was as if someone, or perhaps more than one, had been there recently. In that moment, the terrible truth unfolded in my mind. Thomas, or someone before him, had been brought here. We stood in silence, the weight of the discovery crushing any words. Our breaths seemed to be the only living thing in that space, each labored breath filling the air with our disbelief and fear. Pavel, the most skeptical among us, was pale, his eyes fixed on the footprints. He whispered something about leaving, his voice trembling and almost inaudible. But something told me we hadn't seen everything yet, that there was still something to be revealed, a truth I feared but needed to know. In the corner of the room, a narrow corridor extended, swallowed by shadows that seemed to watch us back. The air along the corridor was thicker, almost hostile, and the cold was cutting, not just from its temperature, but from what it seemed to carry. With each step, the feeling that we were trespassing on something forbidden intensified. We moved slowly, each of us, with our hearts beating so loudly it felt as if it echoed off the stone walls. And as we entered that dark corridor, the certainty grew within me. We were crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. At the end of the corridor, we found a small, sparse room, almost empty, but with something that made the blood freeze in my veins. A pile of abandoned clothes, and on top, a jacket I knew well, Thomas's. I recognized the patch on the left shoulder. The lucky charm he always claimed brought him fortune. The mere glimpse of that jacket drained any remaining courage we had. Pavel took a few steps back, his eyes wide, murmuring that we needed to leave immediately, but I knew, deep down, it was too late. The feeling that we were being watched became almost tangible, as if the darkness itself were spying on us with invisible, ancient eyes. Panic overtook us. We were on the verge of running when a low sound, a faint and distorted whisper, echoed from somewhere deeper in the darkness. The words were unintelligible, but there was something profoundly unsettling in that murmur, a rhythm that seemed to call to us, to draw us in. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and the instinct to survive screamed for us to flee. Pavel was pulling at my arm, his voice choked with fear, begging us to leave. I was about to follow him when... Then I heard something that made my heart stop. It was a clearer whisper, a voice that sounded familiar, a voice that resembled Thomas's, or at least something grotesquely imitating his tone. Against all common sense, I took a few steps toward the sound, unable to resist the macabre pull. With every step, it felt as though the air around me grew denser, oppressive, almost solid. The whispers began to reverberate off the stone walls, multiplying filling every corner of the room, turning the space into a labyrinth of disjointed echoes. It was as if the murmurs were penetrating my mind, each whispered syllable an invisible blade that cut away any remnants of sanity. I called out Thomas's name, my voice trembling, but all we got in return was that incessant, terrifying whisper. It intensified, growing insidiously, until I realized, with indescribable horror, that it wasn't a voice asking for help. It was repeating something incomprehensible, something so ancient that the words seemed to die upon reaching the air. A thought invaded my mind, as clear as it was inevitable. This wasn't trying to be found. It wanted to find us. Terrified, we finally made the decision to leave. We turned abruptly and started running down the corridor, but it felt like with every step, we were moving farther away from the exit. The walls around us seemed to close in, as if the darkness, once still, was now alive, trying to trap us there, at the bottom of that abyssal temple. Pavel tripped and nearly fell, and I grabbed him with all my strength, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. With each second, the air grew heavier, the pressure mounting as if the temple itself were sucking the life out of us, pulling us farther from the world outside. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we reached the staircase. We climbed it desperately, too afraid to look back, and pushed the door open with such force that it slammed against the stone wall, echoing a dull sound in the dense silence surrounding us. When we stepped out of the temple, the night felt more stifling than ever, as if the village itself had stopped to watch us, holding its breath in a deadly silence. We stumbled back to the village, our faces covered in dirt, our hearts still racing, unsure if we were finally free or if, somehow, the terror of that night had followed us. The houses were dark, the streets deserted, and everything seemed immersed in an eerie stillness, as if the village were avoiding us, or worse, as if it had withdrawn into its own world, oblivious to our existence. The next day, we tried to tell the other young people what we had seen, but no one wanted to listen. They looked at us with empty expressions, as if we were talking about something irrelevant. It was as if a veil of denial had fallen over everyone, as if they preferred to ignore the truth rather than face it. Those who disappeared were, to them, just a part of a tradition that everyone seemed to accept with an almost unsettling calmness. The harvest, the earth, the festival, everything was interconnected in a way that we, the younger ones, could never comprehend. Since then, we have avoided the temple, but the festival continues, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Every year, a silent tension fills the air, a suffocating feeling that pushes us further apart, more disconnected from each other. The village keeps its secrets, and we are left on the outside, as if we were intruders in our own home. I've thought many times about running away, leaving the village behind, and trying to forget what we experienced. But something inside me knows that no matter how far I go, a part of that whisper will follow me. The last time I tried to talk about it with my grandmother, she looked at me with a mix of pity and disappointment, as if she knew I would never understand, but also that I had no choice. "The earth takes what is hers," was all she said, in a grave tone, like a warning that silenced me immediately. Something changed in the elders since Thomas's disappearance. They are more reserved, more somber, and now, as the festival approaches, there is a rigidity in their behavior, as if they fear something they cannot control. This year, the rituals have increased. More offerings have been made to the earth, more food, more of everything. I don't know if it's fear or respect, but there is a strange presence in the air, as if something is about to happen, something that everyone expects but no one wants to see. I feel as though we, the young ones, are becoming more and more distant from them, as if we are strangers in a place we once called home. I don't know what awaits us, but one thing is certain: the festival will continue, and we will continue to play our part, aware that something older and greater than all of us lurks in the shadows. The village has made its choice, and I, no matter how much I want to, know that I may never escape this tradition.